Welcome to everyone. You are here at our Rise and Shine sourdough bread making session 2, and we are glad to see everybody back. For those of you that may not know, the University of Illinois Extension is the flagship outreach effort of University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and we offer research-based educational programs to the residents of Illinois in all of our 102 counties and far beyond. And I am your moderator. My name's Susan Glassman. I'm a nutrition and wellness educator up here serving LaSalle, Bureau, Marshall, and Putnam counties. And our presenters are with us today, and they're both University of Illinois educators and serving Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties. I'd like to introduce first Nick Frillman. And Nick is a local food systems and small farms educator. Originally, Nick is from the northwest suburbs of Antioch, Illinois, and he grew up with a deep appreciation for fresh local food. And he had many experiences purchasing meat, eggs, vegetables directly from small family farms of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin growing up. After graduating from crop sciences from U of I, Nick worked in vegetable farming and was an apprentice in Oregon. He joined Illinois Extension team in January 2021, and he was inspired by a neighbor's gift of sourdough bread back in 2023, and he spent the past year tuning his own sourdough bread recipe and is excited to share that along with the passion for making sourdough with you all today. And Jenna Smith is a nutrition and wellness educator and registered dietitian. She grew up on a farm 20 miles south of Springfield, where she became interested in the connection between agriculture and health. After graduating from Food, Nutrition, and Dietetics program at Illinois State, she received her master's in public health from University of Illinois at Springfield. And Jenna worked as a clinical dietitian for 5 years before joining Extension in 2009. She has a passion for teaching food preservation, including fermentation, and has enjoyed working and experimenting with sourdough. So once again, we welcome everyone to our last session of the sourdough web presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jenna to start us off.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Susan. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera here. So that way we'll make sure we've got enough bandwidth here to get this presentation going. But really appreciate all of you who are tuning in today. If you were able to listen in to our first session, we talked about kind of the differing types of flours. Nick talked about using local flours, and then we walked you through how to make your own sourdough starter. Again, if you weren't able to join us, we will be sending out that recording of that session. We plan to get that to you hopefully midweek next week. But today we're going to discuss the many benefits of sourdough. We'll talk about the supplies that are needed. And finally, we'll give you the steps to make that traditional sourdough bread. We do understand, there are so many ways to make sourdough. When I first started this venture, I was completely overwhelmed by all the information, especially since, a lot of it seemed kind of contradictory. So really what we wanted to do is sift through all of that information for you and give you like the Cliff Notes version of the most commonly used technique and approach. And we recognize that our way is not the only way to make sourdough bread, but we believe that the process that we walk you through today will offer kind of that very best chance of success. Okay, so let me get to my next slide. So just as a warning, we are going to go through it. We're going to kind of throw in some fancy terms like Autolyse and levain, and we're going to go even to do little like some basic math. So this is a lot of information that we will likely, it could be overwhelming if you've never made sourdough bread before, but we do encourage you to simply just start making bread. That's the best way to learn. And as you start making the bread, it will eventually make sense and it will eventually all come together. Plus, we're going to send out these slides along with the handouts and the recordings. So you can always refer back to them too if you need to do that. I know I have had to refer back to many of my resources and still, at times still do that today, and that's okay. All right. So the benefits of sourdough are many. First of all, it has a long shelf life. So the low pH or the high acidity of the bread inhibits mold growth. This doesn't mean that mold will never grow, of course, but I have found that generally it takes about a week for mold to start to appear. And usually my family has no problems eating up the bread before it actually goes bad. Sourdough is also easier to digest because the long fermentation time, it breaks down some of the carbohydrates and the proteins into smaller units. So it's already pre-digested when you consume it. And some people who are maybe sensitive to gluten, they may be able to still tolerate small amounts of sourdough and not have the bowel irritation like gas and bloating because the lactic acid bacteria, it releases protease enzymes that break down the gluten over time. Now, for those of celiac disease, the only way to manage symptoms is strict avoidance of gluten in the diet. So any gluten containing bread, which includes sourdough, unless you're making that gluten free sourdough, would still not be safe to consume. Sourdough has potentially a lower glycemic index, which glycemic index is a number that measures how quickly a food raises blood sugar levels. Now, more research on this is needed, but we found some studies show that the sourdough fermentation inhibits the enzymes that metabolize starches and that slows down that digestion. It reduces that spike in blood sugars. And finally, due to the fermentation process, it makes nutrients more bioavailable, meaning that nutrients like magnesium and iron and calcium and zinc, which are found in whole grain flours. So if you're using whole grain flour, that's great because you're going to absorb more of them and it's just better absorbed, better utilized by the body. Okay, so there are quite a few tools that a sourdough baker may use, but not all of them are going to be absolutely necessary. So we'll walk you through some of these here. First of all, you need some type of non-reactive container. So I typically like to use a glass bowl to mix the dough in, but then I transfer it to this plastic container in the top of the picture that you see here. So a glass bowl, really nice and easy to mix the dough in and do what's called the stretch and folds, which Nick will get to here in a minute. But it's not real easy to tell like how much the dough has risen when you are bulk fermenting. And so this plastic container here, it's not domed, so it's really easy to kind of mark how much the dough has risen. The digital kitchen scale, so as mentioned last week, most sourdough recipes are written in grams because it's a more accurate unit of measurement. And the ratios that we talk about, like if you're using a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, well, that is meant for grams. So we highly recommend getting a digital scale if you don't already have one. A plastic bowl scraper, this is that kind of gray item in the middle of the picture. This one is not really necessary, quite honestly, just because you can, use your clean hands to mix the ingredients of the dough together. A scraper is just something that can be nice to kind of scrape that dough off the sides of the bowl if you need it or want it. Now, the dough or bench scraper, that's that stainless steel rectangle with the wooden handle there. This one is very helpful when you're dividing the dough and shaping the dough. So while you can get away without having one, I think you'll find that it is much easier to handle the dough when you do have one of these bench scrapers. A food thermometer, I don't have this in the picture, but it is helpful for taking the dough temperature during that bulk fermentation process because you should be going by temperature of the dough and not by the time. So Nick will get into that in a minute. Banneton basket, or sometimes called maybe a proofing basket that you see here in this picture. It usually comes with a liner, which you can choose to use or not. It really doesn't matter. But, if you don't use the liner, the dough will have the same pattern as the basket. And this is used to store the dough in the refrigerator once you've shaped it. And honestly, you don't really have to have this particular basket. You can just use any type of bowl that's generally the same size or so. And you just line it with like a tea towel and dust it with flour. A bread lame or a razor blade. So this is used for scoring the dough just before you bake it. You could try using maybe a knife or kitchen shears to snip that dough. But again, a razor blade is real simple to use. A Dutch oven with a lid, so mine's the red one here in this picture, it needs to be able to withstand temperatures of 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And so while you don't have to have a Dutch oven, the traditional sourdough with that crusty outer edge, it's created from the steam that's trapped in the Dutch oven. And so you can try to maybe mimic this in something like a loaf pan with maybe another loaf pan placed on top. But really, again, I think you'll find that you'll really want that Dutch oven. Some of them, I realize they can be a little bit expensive, but generally you might be able to find some on Facebook Marketplace or I don't know, wherever, right? You might be able to find some. And if not, it's a good Christmas present that maybe Santa will bring you here in a few weeks. You'll also learn, or you'll also see kind of in this picture, there is like a flour duster used to dust flour on top of the loaf before you bake it. There's a brush to brush off any excess flour on your dough. Basically, two things you really don't have to have, but they came in the kit that I bought with the Banneton basket. So that's why I have them. So you have seen this slide if you attended the last session. It's a duplicate, but it's also just a really good reminder. We do want to make sure we're washing, rinsing, sanitizing, and just letting everything air dry. All of our kind of containers, equipment, work surfaces prior to really starting making your bread. If you are using any kind of chlorine bleach to sanitize your surfaces, just remember, rinse those surfaces off with water after you've used that bleach, because that will help to remove any kind of residue that might compete with some of that good fermenting bacteria. Of course, do not forget to wash your hands. So throughout this process, you should be washing your hands quite often. So just making sure too that you're scrubbing your hand with soap and water. And that scrubbing time should take 10 to 15 seconds to scrub it all in. So we're going to now kind of show you the steps to making that traditional sourdough loaf. So for the most part, there are around 10 steps. There might be a few more steps. There might be maybe a few fewer steps, but for the most part, it's generally around 10 steps or so. And these steps generally do span a period of about 3 days. So you're not going to actually do everything in one day, which does mean that you really do need to plan ahead whenever you're making sourdough. This might seem like a lot of steps, but really, most of it is hands off, where you're just simply waiting. So I'm not going to go through all these steps right now. Nick is going to go into each one of these in detail. But the 6 steps that are here on this slide, all of them can be done on day 1, other than, I guess, that very first one where it says feed the starter. You're feeding the starter first to get it ready, just like normal. You're going to want to do that the day before. But then you're going to make the leaven. We'll explain that in a minute. And do all these steps. It's all going to be done in just one day. That picture that you actually see here, this is the 4th step. This is where Nick is doing some stretch and folds to help develop the gluten network of our dough and to help just make that dough nice and strong. And here's the last kind of 4 steps. After the final shaping, you'll want to put the Banneton in the refrigerator, called a cold ferment or cold proofing. And that's going to really help to get more of that sour flavor. Now, you don't have to do that. You could do what's called a countertop ferment and just leave it at room temperature, generally, anywhere between 1 and 4 hours, and then straight bake it. But either one is fine. Nick will talk more about it here in a minute. But after that, steps 9 and steps 10 are generally done the next day. So I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Nick is going to go into each one of these in more detail. Okay, go for it, Nick.
All right. Thanks, Jenna. Looking forward to sharing all this. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And yeah, just getting right into it. Our first step in making our sourdough bread is making a levain from your starter. The first step, as I mentioned, is make a levain. A levain is simply a newer offshoot of your sourdough starter. While you could just feed your starter and use it in your bread recipe once it has doubled in size, we've found that creating a levain provides consistent results with several advantages. First, it allows you to scale up the quantity that's needed in the recipe. So a recipe like ours will tell you how many grams of levain that's needed. For instance, our first recipe in our resources calls for 120 grams of levain. Generally, most people may not hold on to that much. So I definitely do, but some people don't. So if you have a small amount of starter, making a levain can be beneficial in that regard. The second benefit is creating a levain allows you to keep and maintain a smaller amount of starter in your fridge, meaning that overall you'll need less flour to feed that starter frequently. And as people may have seen in the last presentation, we really like using locally or regionally milled flour. That's not necessary, but if you do that, it is more expensive. So it's nice to feed less if you can. Third benefit, using a levain to bake ensures that you'll always have starter left over. Otherwise, you can run the risk of accidentally not having enough starter left over to keep and maintain it for the next time baking. I have done this more than once. It is possible. And then finally, and I think most importantly, this ensures making the levain after already having fed the starter the day before. That ensures a healthy amount of yeast-based fermentation activity prior to making the main dough, which is essential for those of you that really want that sourdough oven spring or a rising of the dough in the baking process. Okay, so how do we exactly make this levain? First, you need to look at the recipe as mentioned and find out how much levain you need. Most sourdough recipes assume what's called a seeding rate of 20%. That's just you're seeding your main dough with a certain percentage of your levain. 20% of our 600 gram recipe is 120 grams of levain as a target, but a good rule of thumb is make a slightly larger amount of levain than you need. I've seen some loss, so I'll target like 150 grams to make. And then when I have it on the scale and it's all risen, I have 140 and some odd grams. I believe that I'm losing a certain amount to evaporation or just yeast activity and gas release. But anyway, for example, let's say the recipe calls for your 120 grams of levain. If we're doing a 1:1:1 ratio of starter, flour, and water, as is our recommendation for beginners, that means we're using 50 grams of starter plus 50 grams of flour plus 50 grams of water, which would equal that 150 grams of levain. Again, slightly more than the 120 grams needed. In this case, it's better to have a little bit too much than not enough. Now we feed your main starter. You feed your main starter the day before you make your levain, again, to ensure good starter activity. Jenna covered this a little bit ago. And the day that you want to make your levain, here's what you do. You get a separate jar. So you have your starter in one jar. I keep mine in a quart jar because I have a lot. I get a separate jar, about a pint jar, and I transfer 50% of that active starter into that jar on a scale after tearing the weight of the jar. Then I had 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. So I've achieved my 1:1:1 ratio. Mix thoroughly with a spatula or a spoon. And then I add a rubber band at the level of the dough on the outside of the jar. Congratulations, you've made your first levain. If you've never done this before, it is fun. And then we, of course, put the lid on the jar just finger tight, not really tight at all. And we keep that in a warm place. I put mine in the oven with the light on and allow it to rise to its peak before use. Your first time doing this, make sure to check the temp of your levain after about an hour to verify that it's not too hot in the oven. My oven with the light on keeps things at about keeps things at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about optimal. And some people, it's a little bit colder, some people a little warmer. The rest of that levain, if you have any extra, can be discarded. It's so little that I just don't worry about it. If you want to keep it, you're more than welcome to keep it. You could give it away, etc. And this is a really nice visual representation of exactly what's going on when we are using our levain at its peak. We mentioned using the levain at its peak. This means it's best to use when it has doubled in size. So again, we put that rubber band around the jar at the level where we've mixed everything down into the bottom of that pint jar. Once I see that it's doubled, then it's good to go. How long it takes exactly to rise depends upon your yeast activity, your levain ratio, and temperature. A 1:1:1 ratio, again, starter flour and water, with a temperature of about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, generally takes, in my experience, about 3 to 3.5 hours to rise to its peak. A higher ratio of flour and water used in a colder environment will take longer. Jenna actually makes her levain the night before she bakes, and we'll explain more of this timeline of hers later. So there are options besides a 1:1:1 ratio that may be beneficial for planning. Jenna drew this graph of what's happening with the levain. And so here's what's happening. As you first feed it, that yeast and the lactic acid bacteria are then starting to eat all the carbohydrates in the levain mixture, but they have a long way to go to get through it all. As it's doing this, you'll start to see more and more bubbles. The bubbles are the carbon dioxide that is trapped inside the gluten network or the gluten matrix. You'll hear different terms. The carbon dioxide is what is making your levain rise. When it's just over the peak, all the sugars and carbohydrates have been eaten. The easily accessible foodstuffs for your yeast and bacteria are gone. There's no longer any easy food available. And so the yeast and the LAB, lactic acid bacteria, are hungry. And so what do? They start to break down that gluten network, and then your carbon dioxide escapes and the levain starts to fall. Is it a huge deal if you use it just after its peak? No, I tend to use it just before I see it double, just for safety, but I've done it after the peak before many times, not way past the peak. You may want to just try again. You miss it, you get busy doing something, you get distracted, but you'll get the best, most consistent results and a quicker bulk fermentation time if you're using the levain at its peak versus well before or after. Okay, so now we're past step 1. And so we're into steps 2 and 3, creating either an Autolyse or a fermentolyse. That's step 2. And then step 3 is adding salt and mixing. So I'm going to go into both of these and break it down just a bit. And then I have a helpful visual aid on the next couple of slides. While you're waiting for your levain to peak, if you're going the Autolyse route, you can do that at that time. So those 3 to 3.5 hours of waiting time, and Autolyse comes in handy for that. If you're choosing it to use a fermentolyse, you must wait for your levain to double. Yes, I know. We know there's more terms to keep track of, but I'm going to try and explain these really well. With an Autolyse, all we're doing is what is that? We are mixing flour together with our water and then simply letting that water flour mixture rest for at least an hour covered. It does have its benefits and it has 1 or 2 drawbacks. It is good for higher hydration doughs. So more than a 70% hydration, that's a good benchmark. Above that, we may want to go the Autolyse route. At that level or below, we may be okay with fermentolyse. Don't worry, we'll talk about hydration in the next slides to come. And this option is also good for using whole grains in our doughs because whole grain flour does take more time to fully absorb all that water that we add. It also creates a smoother, more elastic dough with a strong gluten network that makes stretching and folding easier, and it hastens gluten development process. So the fermentolyse, what's that about? And what is that? The fermentolyse is simply when you mix everything together except the salt at the very beginning, and you let that mixture rest for 30 to 40 minutes. So the only difference between the two is the Autolyse is just flour and water. The fermentolyse is our flour, water with our starter. And so if you want to go the fermentolyse route, that means that your levain needs to be at its peak when you start the fermentolyse. Again, it works well when you're using flours that are not whole grain or a flour ratio of mostly just white flour and a little bit of whole wheat flours, such as all-purpose or mostly bread flours. It's good for lower hydration doughs. It is what I prefer because it allows me to start the bulk fermentation process effectively 3.5 hours earlier because I'm not doing an hour earlier because I'm not doing an Autolyse, but we'll get to that. Whenever you first add in the starter or levain, I should mention, whenever your levain makes contact with your flour and water, that starts the bulk fermentation time. This is going to be significant in a later slide, but I just wanted to note that it's okay that we don't cover the significance of that right this second. Since it's added from the very beginning, it will start the bulk fermentation time earlier. That does save people time. So if you're really crunched for time, what I want to communicate is the fermentolyse has its benefits there. Okay, so this is a helpful next 2 slides worth of visual aid. In our first webinar, we had a couple people say, this is great information, thanks, but I need to see the process a little bit more. So we tried to meet that request. So this is a picture of these next two slides are pictures of the total fermentalized process. I did not take photos of the Autolyse process. Apologize for that. I do feel like the Autolyse process is rather more straightforward than the fermentalized, but here we go. So step one, you could see top left of the screen, we have our bowl on a scale. We tear our scale to 0. Step 2, we add our starter, that should say add levain. My apologies. And that should have doubled at that point. You could see 100 grams. Well, that's interesting because our recipe calls for 120. I make slightly smaller bread loaves, but it's still a 20% seeding rate. So 500 gram flour loaf is my target. And so 100 is 20% of 500. So we have our levain there. Next, we tear our scale. So now we have our levain in our bowl, tear it again to 0 grams. So we can adequately measure our water. Bottom left of the picture, we add water right on top of our levain. It does look weird. You'll think you're drowning your levain. It's okay. Your yeast and bacteria will be fine. So 375 grams. If anybody cares to do the math there, that's a 75% hydration rate. Then we grab our whisk and then we whisk it into oblivion, and it should be completely mixed at the end, bottom right. Also, I'm sorry, that text should say completely mixed. All right, on the next picture, so now we had our completely whisked levain and water in our previous picture. Now we tear that scale again and we add 500 grams of flour. I let that sit for 30 minutes covered after we mix it. And then we add 2% by weight of salt. So that's 10 grams here. And then last but not least, we mix with a scraper and we let that sit an additional 30 minutes and cover. I'm guessing I'm going to get the question, how come you don't add in the salt with the starter or with the levain, flour, water, and have it all done with? I had that same question when I first went the fermentalized route, and my mentor told me that the salts will actually make the gluten matrix, the gluten network, contract right away, which is fine later on in the process. But at the beginning, it can stifle the natural gluten development to some extent, hence the wait step. So now, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about hydration. We're going to do a little math here. While you probably don't really need to understand hydration at the very beginning of your sourdough bread making journey, we are adding this in here today for all those of you who have seen discussions, maybe on social media, baking Facebook pages, etc., about hydration rate and wondered what the heck they're talking about. It can be very beneficial for you to know and understand the hydration rate of your dough, which is simply the percentage of water to flour in your recipe. So we take the weight of our water divided by weight of flour and multiply by 100. That's how we get percentage of hydration. Super easy. For example, let's say that our recipe calls for 350 grams of water and 500 grams of flour. To find out the hydration percentage, you would divide 350 grams water by 500 grams of flour times 100, and we arrive to 70%. A recipe that's 70% hydration is generally good for beginners to start with, just because it's usually easier to work with and shape. However, it does definitely depend on your flour mixture. If you're using all 100% whole grain flours in your recipe, or even 50-50 whole grains and non-whole grains, a 70% hydration dough will likely end up being too dry. Your bread will be dense and it'll probably make the dough harder to work with. Most sourdough bread recipes are between 70 to 90% hydration rate. Higher hydration doughs can and do give a thinner, crispier crust and a lighter, airier crumb or, bread component internal to the loaf. But a higher hydration dough will also be a bit wetter, as that's what hydration means after all, and sticky and harder to work with. So we recommend starting at about 70%-ish hydration and working your way up if desired. You will note, if you've studied our resources, that one of our recipes does call for 77% hydration. Give that one a try. And if you want to experiment, work your way up the next time and add just a bit more. I will say a couple percentage points increase in hydration will amaze you in terms of the difference it'll have on your dough. By understanding hydration and the effects of different flours, it can actually be very easy to modify recipes or even create your own. Now we're into another visual aid. So we're into step 4 now, the stretch and fold process.
Once your dough has rested, covered for 30 minutes, it's time to begin. To start, Wet your hands with water to prevent sticking and gently handle the dough. Perform 4 stretch and folds around the dough. Begin by pulling the dough from the top of the bowl and stretching it upward, then folding it down toward the center. Rotate the bowl a quarter turn and repeat this process. Continue until you've stretched and folded from all 4 sides. After completing the stretch and fold, cover the dough and let it rest for another 20 to 30 minutes. Repeat the process 2 to 3 more times, letting the dough rest in between.
All right, awesome. Hopefully everybody was able to see that video. Again, we're recording this whole thing, so we'll be able to share these videos out, and that'll be a great resource. So after you do 1 round of stretch and folds, we do cover that dough and we let it rest for 30 minutes, and we do all that over again and again and again. We repeat that, so you do end up doing a total of 3 to 4 stretch and folds. Try 3, and then next time try 4, see if you see any difference. The purpose of doing stretch and folds, however, is to develop our gluten network. The gluten network holds all the CO2 that's produced by our wild yeasts and bacteria so that it doesn't fall flat when we bake it. There are different techniques to developing gluten. Some may knead the dough by hand, while others might use a mixer. Some may even do coil folds, which is just another way to stretch the dough. We won't get into that today. But the most common way to develop our gluten during the process is the stretch and fold technique, which we just showed. It is beginner friendly. Jenna and I have both done it many times. So now step 5, bulk fermentation. So Jenna started to describe this process a little bit earlier in our presentation. I would go out on a limb and say that this is probably the most talked about topic within sourdough baking. Maybe Jenna disagrees. It's certainly one of the top ones. And the question being, how much do you want your dough to rise? And how can you tell when enough is enough? And then sometimes things underproof, sometimes things overproof, etc. After you've completed all your stretch and folds, again, different recipes call for different amounts of them every 30 minutes. It's time to transfer that dough to a see-through container and let the dough rise. Again, that glass bowl that Jenna was showing earlier, that's, concave. And so it makes it kind of hard to tell how much the dough is rising because as it works its way up the bowl, it's a wider bowl from bottom to top. These containers here, I've heard them called restaurant prep containers. I'm not really sure exactly what the names of them are really helpful. This is the bulk fermentation process going forward. So many recipes will go by a range of time that it says you need X amount of bulk fermentation. Some will say until the dough is doubled or risen a certain percentage, but not being certain of all these variables on the screen here can lead to overproofing or underproofing if your bulk rise percentage is not correlated to temperature. The percent rise that you are looking for really truly depends on the dough's temperature. So if you have that meat thermometer handy, you're going to need it. If you don't have one, definitely invest in one if you're going to be a perfectionist like me and try and get optimal oven spring and all that. It should only double if you're fermenting in cooler temps with a dough temp around 65 degrees. As we can see in this chart from the sourdough journey, at the bottom of the chart, it says our dough temperature, if it's 65 degrees, which is pretty darn cold, needs a percent rise of 100%. That will happen eventually. Again, we put this in the container with the lid on. And if that dough stays at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to do it, but it's going to do it in 12 to 16 hours. So it can really prolong the baking process in general if you ferment at a colder temperature. But there are some people that really like the flavors that come along with that. It is then on the top part of our screen, warm dough of 80 degrees Fahrenheit only needs a 30% rise by contrast. It's recommended to take, again, the temperature of the dough multiple times throughout the bulk fermentation process and take the average when considering what percent rise to stop at. It's really helpful if you really get to know the temperature of, let's say, your oven with just the light on, no oven actually on to speak of. That would be disastrous. Again, my oven with the light on, the door closed, and the lid on this container in the picture ends up keeping the dough about 75-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Looking at this picture, you could see the bottom rubber band indicating the top of the dough at the beginning of our bulk fermentation time. The average dough temperature was about 74 degrees Fahrenheit. We can round up to 75. So when you look at this chart, we know that we need about a 50% rise. This is marked with the top rubber band and the dry erase marker where Jenna wrote 50%. I don't even do this anymore. I just eyeball it. It does get harder to eyeball 30% rise though. So if you're not comfortable with it, rubber bands or dry erase markers can be helpful. The dough, when it's air quotes done, I say done very hesitatingly because it's so controversial. The dough, when it's done according to this chart, let's say, will be slightly domed. As we could see in the picture, it's coming away from the edges of the container a bit because of that doming, and it will have some bubbles forming at the top that kind of make the sides look like a sponge. Bulk fermenting is an important step. Under fermenting will result in a lack of good oven spring, which just means it won't rise that much in the oven, and it could be dense and gummy, and it could result in crust tearing, which is due to too much yeast activity during baking. Over fermenting will result in the gluten structure degrading and turning your dough into a big gooey mess, which will make it super hard to shape. Going by this chart, ignoring the clock, using a thermometer to ID target percent rise, you will get it right. I won't say every time, but most times. Okay, step 6, we're almost there. We're getting halfway done. Now these get a little simpler now. So division if needed and pre-shaping. Now, let's say our dough is done bulk fermenting. We've hit our target rise or approximately, or we're just darn tired of waiting and we'll give our bake a try anyway. So first step, turn our dough out onto the counter. You'll see these doughs are on a silicone baking mat. This is not necessary. A counter is perfectly fine. Just clean your counter first. Don't add flour to your counter. I know we've seen it done with Christmas cookies and pizza dough and stuff. Don't do it. You need the surface tension of your counter to help you shape. You'll see in a second. Using your bench scraper, the metal bench scraper we had pictured earlier, divide into 2 pieces, which will end up being their own 2 little breads, or don't. I typically don't divide my breads, or I'll make a double recipe and I will divide. I shoot for about 500 grams per loaf. Sometimes I want to make 2, etc. So regardless of division or not, we're going to pre-shape our dough, and then we're going to let our dough rest for 20 to 30 minutes. And we're going to show you another video now that will demonstrate exactly that pre-shaping of the dough process and then final shaping.
Now it's time for pre-shaping, an important step in creating a well-structured dough. Start by using a bench scraper or your floured hands. Begin folding one side of the dough into the center, gently pressing it down. Next, fold the opposite side over, meeting in the middle. Then bring the top edge down toward the center and fold the bottom edge up to complete the process. Once the folds are done, carefully flip the dough over so the seam is on the bottom. Now, place the bench scraper beneath the dough. Move it around in a circular motion, using light pressure to tighten the dough into a smooth, round shape. When the dough has taken shape, let it rest for 20 to 30 minutes. Once your dough has finished resting, it's time to move on to the final shaping. Begin by gently stretching and pulling the dough into a rectangular shape, being careful not to deflate it. Take the right side of the dough and fold it inward toward the center. Then repeat this motion with the left side, folding it over the previous fold so they meet in the middle. Next, starting at the bottom edge of the rectangle, begin rolling the dough upward. Roll it tightly but carefully, aiming to create an even, smooth surface as you go. Once you've reached the top, gently pull the sides of the dough downward to tuck and round the edges. Now that your dough is shaped, it's ready to go into the bowl for proofing. Flip the dough seam side up into an oval-shaped bowl that has been generously dusted with flour to prevent sticking. Ensure it's centered and has room to expand as it proofs.
Okay, so there was a lot there. Definitely recognize that. Also, I believe there's a moderate typo instead of final shape. Yeah, we are shaping it into a boule or a batard. I heard in the captions, we're going to transfer our dough into a boule. That should be into a banneton, which is a floured basket. We'll show you just in a moment. But great visual demonstration of the process. So when you're shaping, You're building structure of the dough by layering the dough onto itself and then tightening it up to build surface tension, which will give you the best oven spring and then rise in the oven. Depending on the shape of your banneton, the basket that I mentioned, you'll shape your dough into a boule or a batard. So there's different shaped baskets. That's all those terms mean. If you want to shape it into a batard instead of a boule, a batard's a bit longer, batard's a little rounder. We suggest watching a video on YouTube in the channel Food Geek. If you just search Food Geek batard shaping, you'll see the video. You want to lightly dust your bannetons with flour, rice flour, or other gluten-free flour is best because it helps the flour from sticking to the banneton while also not sticking too much to the dough. Okay, step 8, we're almost there. Cold ferment or cold proof. Simply put, once the dough is shaped and in your banneton, you're ready to cold ferment. You'll simply cover that banneton, such as with an elastic food cover or plastic wrap, and place it in the refrigerator. Can you skip this step altogether and proof at room temperature for a couple hours before going straight to baking same day? As Jenna mentioned, yes, you can, in which case you would allow it to countertop final proof. But the cold ferment has a lot of advantages, and most professional sourdough bakers will tell you not to skip this step. First of all, cold fermenting helps develop the flavor. It really won't rise in the fridge at all because at cold temperatures, the yeasts go to sleep, but the lactic acid bacteria are still working. So it makes the dough a bit more sour. It's easier to score a cold dough out of the fridge, which we'll talk about next, and it allows you to bake the bread on your own time at any point the next day, because at the time that you transfer the dough into the banneton or the batard shape, it'll probably be evening time past the point of dinner. So tomorrow, the next day rather, you could take it out to bake and have a nice warm bread for breakfast or lunch. Scoring the dough, step 9 of 10. So that next day, you'll preheat the oven, and while it's preheating, you'll take that banneton out of the fridge and turn the dough out onto a parchment paper, or you could buy what's called a bread sling made of silicone. Parchment paper or a bread sling allows you to pick up your dough and place that in a hot Dutch oven without burning your hands. You'll lightly dust the surface with flour. Rice flour also doesn't brown in the oven. So if you're into like aesthetic, that's kind of a cool thing. And smooth it over the top of the dough with your hand using a bread lame, which is that picture on the right of the screen, that little wood handle thing that holds a razor blade, or just the razor blade itself. We score the dough. Scoring the dough simply means cutting the dough, and you can get totally fancy with decorative scoring if you wish. There are a lot of examples you can find on the internet. But the main thing that you're trying to do is make one primary cut about 1/2 inch deep. A sourdough loaf may increase to about 3 times its original size while it's baking. So by scoring the dough with a primary cut before baking, you're creating a weak point in the dough where the gas can escape as your bread rises and expands in the oven. If you do not score your dough, it will burst open at the weakest point or just randomly across the loaf, which A, doesn't make it look so nice, and B, may inhibit oven spring. All right, so baking in the oven, it does need a hot oven. There are some people that bake with a cold oven and just like turn it on at 450, throw their loaf in and wait for it to rise naturally. We didn't do that. That's not what we suggest. Most sourdough is baked in a hot oven, generally about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. So preheat the oven with the Dutch oven inside of it to get it nice and hot and saturated with heat. Some bakers may actually preheat to 500 degrees and then turn it down to 450 to bake. That's actually what I do. But you ought to check with your oven manufacturer that your oven can handle this high of a heat. So start at 450 and go from there. So first, lift up your parchment paper or bread sling with the dough, set it inside the Dutch oven after it's been heated for about 30 minutes, being careful not to burn yourself. Bake that dough for, it says 30 minutes with the lid on. I actually do 22 minutes with the lid on. Then we remove the lid and bake for another 15 to 30 minutes until you have a nice brown outer crust. You really want to watch it here. In my experience, if you bake more than 20 minutes with the lid off, you're going to burn the top of the dough. So start at 15 and watch it. Make sure that you're checking on it. Having that Dutch oven does help you make perfect sourdough bread more easily because it traps the steam inside the pot, which helps create that thick signature crust. I know they're kind of expensive, but you can maybe ask Santa to bring you one. While it's also very tough to do, make sure that you let the loaf cool for at least an hour before slicing the bread. The bread is still cooking even after all of our time suggestions here. Once it's transferred to a cooling rack or the countertop while it cools off, it's cooking internally. And if you slice into it too early, you can get a gummy crumb. Sourdough bread storage. Long story short, just eat it as soon as possible. I'm not going to go over this slide too much because I want to hear your questions, but you can refresh dough that's gone a bit stale in a toaster or with a spritz of water and warm it in the oven. You could freeze it for 2 months. I put mine in a Ziploc gallon freezer bag inside a bread box. And that's after if you put it in a bag before it's completely cooled, you'll have condensation in there and your bread will be wet when you take it out, which is gross. And I've done that. So let it cool for half a day before storing. Okay, cool. Thanks
All right.
everybody that hung out with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending, and be looking for more information coming through the email. And Nick and Jenna, again, thank you very much. We really appreciate everything. Take care, everybody.
See ya.